organization. We encourage you all to take a look at Drive Electric Florida's website to get further information about the organization if you're not aware of it. Today, our webinar is entitled EV Myths and Facts for Decision Makers. We decided to do this webinar because just about every day in the press, you'll read something about electric vehicles, some of which is true, some of which is not true. But there are a lot of misconceptions about the future of electric vehicles in this country. And while we can't cover all of the issues in the hour we have today, we thought we would cover at least some of the major issues. So today we're going to have presentations first from Charles Satterfield with the Edison Electric Institute, who's going to present a national picture to try and dispel the myth that electric vehicles were just a fad and that we're not still growing. You may see articles again in the popular press and the trade press, which suggests that the EV industry is tailing off or dying. We don't believe that's true, and as you'll see, it's especially not true in Florida. The second speaker will be Daniel Wilkins, who's a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. He's going to dispel the myth that electric vehicles are more expensive than internal combustion engine or ICE vehicles. I think, as you'll see, when you talk about the total cost of ownership, electric vehicles tend to be cheaper, at least for a lot of the models, than traditional gasoline-powered vehicles. Then we're going to have Lloyd Graves with Duke Energy talking about the reasons why electric vehicles will not crash the grid. There have been some concerns that the additional power requirements from new EVs would be more than the electric system can handle. That's just not true, and Lloyd's going to talk about that. And finally, we're going to have Pete Westlake from the Orlando Utilities Commission talking about the environmental benefits of EVs, dispelling the myth that because EVs use electricity, there's still considerable environmental impacts, and we want to show that there's clear evidence that EVs are beneficial to the environment. So with that, I want to get us started. We don't have that much time. Our first speaker is Charles Satterfield, who's a senior manager of electric transportation with the Edison Electric Institute. He works to support the efforts of the nation's investor-owned electric companies to advance electric transportation. In this role, Charles leads several initiatives, including the electrification of utility fleets and the EV program database, a publicly available database of EEI member company program offerings related to electric transportation. Prior to joining EEI, Charles was a senior project manager with Atlas Public Policy, where he led all work related to fleet electrification and authored studies to investigate the electrification of all publicly owned vehicles in the state of Washington and the federal fleet. Charles, I'll turn it over to you. Now, one more thing. We have a question and answer box at the bottom of the page. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have as we go through the presentations. We'll also leave time at the very end to ask questions either to individual panelists or to the panel as a whole. Thank you. Go ahead, Charles.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So Bruce said, Charles Satterfield, Senior Manager of Electric Transportation here with EEI. For those of you that are unfamiliar, we are the trade association for the nation's investor-owned utilities. So in Florida, that's FPL, Tampa Electric, and Duke Energy Florida. But we have members in every state and the District of Columbia, collectively serving more than 250 million Americans. So wherever you are in the U.S., there's likely an investor-owned utility that is providing you power. So as the title says, today I'm going to be discussing recent trends in the EV market and some projections in the future. So I'll start with some highlights. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. From a recent report that we released titled Electric Vehicle Sales and Charging Infrastructure Required through 2035. That's a pretty to-the-point title. So this is actually an update of a report that we released back in 2022. Which focused on projections out through 2030 that we decided to update in light of some significant market developments, some policy changes, that sort of thing. So you can see that 2030 forecast there in that black little dots. So the first part of the forecast that we did was an estimate of EV sales through 2035. So to develop that, we take a consensus forecast from 4 different consulting firms. So in this case, EY, PwC, Guidehouse, and Boston Consulting Group. EY, formerly Ernst Young, and PwC, formerly PricewaterhouseCoopers. Everybody now going with just the acronyms, though. So the result of that you can see on the graph here is annual sales are projected to reach 12.2 million in 2035, and that'll represent more than 70% of annual light-duty vehicle sales. So that's a significant increase from our last report in 2022 and reflects the accelerated adoption that we're seeing from only just from estimates only just a few years ago. So interesting to note, though, is that all of the predictions outside of Guidehouse are projecting sales that are lower than the central case analysis, which the EPA published alongside their most recent greenhouse gas emission standard. So this is even after the standards were relaxed compared to the what was initially proposed. But nonetheless, sales are projected to rise rapidly over the next decade. And EVs are going to account for the vast majority of auto sales in 2035. So that said, we do caveat in the report that a lot of the policy drivers behind these projections are subject to change, in particular the tax credits for EVs that were included as part of the Inflation Reduction Act could be on the chopping block during the next round of tax negotiations. EPA regulations are also subject to change. But we should have a much better picture of which way the federal cookie is going to crumble by the end of next month. Next slide, please. All these annual sales add up to cars on the road, and that population, as you can see from the graph here, is set to rise substantially between now and 2035. So currently there are about 5 million EVs on the road, give or take. And that figure is expected to reach, more than 78 million over the next decade. So that'll be a quarter of all the light-duty vehicles on the road in the US will be electric then. That's kind of what that figure equates to. So more than anything, this graph shows the power of exponential growth. It took nearly a decade to reach 5 million EVs, and in the 5 years between 2030 and 2035, we're set to add more than 45 million to the tally. So even taking, the most conservative, this is the midpoint estimate, but even if you were to drop down to the most conservative estimates, we're still adding millions of EVs to the road every single year, past 2030, or really even past this year, since we're set to be between, 1.6 million or something like that. So obviously that's great for emissions reductions, but it does exacerbate the issue of charging infrastructure. So we estimate that we're going to need about 180,000 DC fast chargers in 2035 for the populations of EVs projected to be on the road then. But then that population more than doubles between 2030 and 2035. So we need to repeat the full build out of DCFC almost entirely in that 5-year span. So, we had a decade to build out that first 180,000. Well, really more than a decade to build out that first 180,000. And then we need to repeat that almost fully in the next just 5 years. So to dive a little bit more deeply into that figure, if you go to the next slide, The second part of the paper focuses on charging infrastructure. So to support a population of 78 million EVs, we project that we're going to need more than 42 million charging ports. So the vast majority of that is going to be home charging at single family homes. But we will need about 6 million public workplace and multifamily L2 charge ports. And then finally, we're going to need roughly 325,000 DC fast charge ports. So that's a big task. So we have an interim target, as I said, of 180,000 in 2030, which is the focus of this graph. And despite the challenge of kind of getting from where we are now, which is roughly 47,000 DC fast charge ports, last I looked, which was last night, to that 180,000, we're going to need to see an 18% year-over-year growth between now and 2030 in annual DC fast charge deployments. And then once we hit that kind of 30,000 annual deployment figure, that will need to be maintained for basically the foreseeable future. Maybe tailing off in a long way from now, but that is a tall task. So kind of put that in perspective. It took us, I don't know, the better part of 7 years to install 47,000, and we're going to need to be deploying 30,000 annually. So it's a tall task. Kind of put that in perspective. That's 4 to 5 gigawatts of charging infrastructure. 4 to 5 gigawatts is the amount of power it takes to for all of the Walmarts in the U.S. And that needs to be deployed annually moving forward. So this is a tall task that we're focused on here at EEI in terms of getting more charging infrastructure in the ground. So the point of this analysis is, and something we try to focus on in the report, is that a lot of our industry is focused on 2030, what the world is going to look like then. But as you can see here, the 2030 is closer to the start rather than the finish in terms of EV projections or the EV growth. But now I want to turn the page a little bit and talk about from far off projections and focus on recent trends. So as I'm sure you're all aware, I think we skipped a slide actually. I had another slide in there which seemed to have disappeared. Oh well, that's fine. You can go to just go to the next slide. That's all right. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, much has been made about the decline of EVs. So I'm happy to report that our rumors of our death have been greatly exaggerated. Even though we have started to see a decline in the rate of growth, we are not seeing a decline in sales. So sales this year are up about 12-15% year over year, depending on which source you look at. And now that's not as much as the 30 to 40% growth we were seeing in 2022 and 2030. But there's no such thing as a straight line in terms of adoption of the new technology. And not only that, but the last quarter of the year is typically the strongest for EV sales. And it's still possible that we'll see an additional bump rather than above the one that you're seeing right here on the graph. As now that, especially now that new cheaper models like the Chevy Blazer EV are available. So the focus of this graph in particular, though, is a bit of a deeper dive into the national sales trends. So this is kind of focusing on what the overall market is doing and what Tesla is doing. So you'll see that the decline in EV sales that has been reported on a lot over the last year or so is more accurately described as a decline in Tesla sales. So up until Q2 of last year, Tesla sales accounted for about half of the market. But then you start to see a real significant shift as EV sales from Tesla start to really drop off. Thankfully, that was more than offset by increases in EV sales from other automakers. So you can see the kind of the shifting away of that blue and orange lines. But eventually, as Tesla sales continued to fall off, it dragged down the overall market. Though we're starting to see a bounce back in this year, but really that was driving the national perception more so than an accurate reporting of what was happening overall. But to focus on so another kind of more regional move away from the national picture. If you go to the next slide, I want to take a look at where growth is happening regionally. So this is an encouraging trend, I think, is that we're starting to see significant growth outside of California. So for a long time, the EV market could be summarized as people buying Teslas in California. That was driving pretty much all of the sales growth, the vast majority of the sales growth. As you can see in this graph, this is admittedly a bit of a tortured data set. The graph is showing the states that are accounting for the majority of growth in EV sales. So what this is showing is, say, if EV sales nationally increased 100K from over a year, then this graph is showing which states accounted for that increase in growth. So for the last couple of years, things have been fairly consistent with, California leading the way. The other, number 2 through 10 markets, accounting for, between 9 and 10% or 10 to 7% of that growth. But as you can see in 2024, that changed significantly. So far this year, sales in California of EVs are essentially flat. They're actually down just a hair. But sales elsewhere are driving the growth. So as I said before, there's about 12% growth. The majority of that is accounted for by Florida, actually. So Florida has long time been the second largest EV market in the US, but now it is not only the second largest market, it's the fastest growing market. So that's that green line there that you can see starting to spike in 2024. We're also seeing growth in some other regional markets. So that orange line below it, that's New York, and then Colorado below that one. And then we're also starting to see some significant growth in some of the lagging states. So like Oklahoma seeing a big surge in EV sales, and Alabama and some of the states where you started to see, that took a long time to kind of get set up, are starting to see now more significant growth than some of the previous leaders like California. So I personally think that this is really great for the health of the market. Overall, is that you're starting to see it pick up nationally, and it's no longer just being driven by one big outlier in California kind of driving the narrative. And to hone in on that, if you go to the next slide, you can see this is provided by our friends at Drive Electric Florida. This data is hot off the press, but as you can see, Florida is really blowing away the market overall in terms of EV adoption and has shot up substantially in 2024. So we're seeing significant growth there, and we expect that to continue for the rest of the year. And that is really driving, kind of the new wave of EV adoption in the US is these other markets like Florida, where the sales are very strong. So I don't want to allay any fears about, a pullback in the market, particularly in Florida, where, you guys are leading the way. But that's all I had for today. Is there a question? Yes, this is just light duty. This is not medium and heavy duty. But that has a potential to significantly change, the figures, since we do a lot of work here at EEI with, medium heavy duty OEMs, and the charging infrastructure required for them is significantly more power intensive than for light duty. But this is just light duty that we're focusing on. But we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of years. Other than that, thanks for having me. I'll turn it over to Dan.
Okay, let me introduce Dan first. Daniel Wilkins is a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy, where he creates original research and policy analysis on fleet electrification and advancing electric utility investment in transportation electrification. His practical expertise spans roles with the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Electrification Coalition, and the Environmental Defense Fund. Prior to joining Atlas, he earned his master's in public policy with an emphasis in EV policy from the University of Denver's Joseph Corbel School of International Studies. He also holds a BA in International Affairs from the University of Colorado Boulder. Thanks, and Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you so much for leading the charge here, Charles. So good morning, everybody. As Bruce mentioned, my name is Dan Wilkins. I'm a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. And for those of you that aren't aware of Atlas or haven't heard of our name before, Atlas equips decision makers to make informed, data-driven decisions using our data and using our products and our reports. And we mainly focus on a couple of different pillars, including transportation electrification, building electrification, water policy, disinformation campaigns, and lately we've actually been getting into things like industrial decarbonization and other sectors. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out either after or during the chat. But without any further ado, we can actually get into the presentation. So that I think is related to Charles's presentation. So I think next slide. There we go. Perfect. Thanks. So before I get into the report that I'll be talking about today, I did want to level set and just introduce the report. So Atlas Public Policy, in support with National Resources Defense Council in March of 2024, we analyzed the five most popular in 2023 gasoline-powered vehicles to assess a total cost of ownership, or TCO calculation, to determine how much it costs to purchase and drive a vehicle over its useful life. And we compared those five most popular gas-powered models to a similar sized, both in price, size, displacement, and range, electric vehicle that's also available for purchase today. The reason that we did that is because transportation is obviously very important to folks. It is generally the second largest expenditure for American households. And it is also a fact that 90% of Americans actually have at least one car, or 90% of American households have at least one car, excuse me. So it's important to note that over the last several years, upfront costs of EVs have actually gone down significantly, while their performance and their range have increased. And in this report, we really show that EVs are available now, and the ones that are available now are actually more affordable to drive than most, if not all, of the most popular conventional vehicles of the day and age. And vehicle electrification is expected to improve affordability for households as the technology costs improve, as they continue to decline in terms of relative cost, more models become available, and also as the used EV market continues to grow. And the findings that we will show and detail for you today is that in every case, EVs can deliver savings to owners compared to that gasoline-powered vehicle over a 7-year period, which is the average age of a vehicle before it is sold, from off the lot to becoming a used vehicle at that point. And that's the typical amount of time that drivers keep a newly purchased vehicle. So how we actually performed the analysis is we used one of the tools that Atlas has created called the Fleet Procurement Analysis Tool, or FPAT. And the Fleet Procurement Analysis Tool equips users, with financial and environmental analysis for various fleet procurements. It does a one-for-one conventional vehicle to EV comparison over the total cost and the total life cycle of the vehicle. You can manipulate things from fuel costs to maintenance costs to charging infrastructure costs, to factoring in whether or not charging infrastructure is included in the total cost of ownership, to even including things like the variable MSRP or sticker price of a vehicle, and also even including things like time of use rates. So what time you plan on charging the vehicle, and related to specific electricity rates in your region or in your area based on electric utility costs for residential or for commercial, depending on region, depending on state, depending even on zip code. So it's very granular and it's very customizable. So it's a great use case for the tool and also for what we are analyzing. So can we go to the next slide, please? Excellent. So the analysis that we conducted, we used a combination of default inputs and customizable inputs. As far as vehicles go, like I said, we mentioned or we used the most popular vehicles of their type in all of 2023, and that was according to S&P Global. For home charging, we assumed around 88% of all charging of an EV will be conducted at home, and that's according to a National Renewable Energy Laboratory report that came out in 2023. And we used public charging from Electrify America to really get localized and average costs that people are actually seeing out there in the real world. We used gasoline and residential electricity from EIA, or the Energy Information Administration. We did include the federal $7,500 federal tax credit when it was applicable for the vehicle. So if it qualified at the time of using the analysis, it automatically got the federal tax credit. The expected years of use, again, was 7 years, and we factored in an average vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, of around just under 11,000 years, which is according to the Federal Highway Administration and also Consumer Reports. And then the vehicle prices were selected again on base MSRP that you can currently get for that vehicle, either from fueleconomy.gov or specifically the one outlier that we were not able to find on Fuel Economy, but we were able to find on the manufacturer's website was the Ford F-150 Lightning. So we do have accurate MSRP costs. We have accurate vehicle data, we have accurate insurance costs, things like that. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we found, just as a bottom line up front, is that we show savings across all of the 5 most popular vehicles and their subsequent vehicle types, which includes the compact sedan, compact SUV, midsize SUV, and pickup. And these all show clear cost savings. And my favorite to talk about is the sedan, which I will get into in just a second here. But the way that we found these findings is that we factored in things like taxes and fees for these vehicles, insurance, fuel costs, maintenance and repairs for these vehicles, and then also the vehicle price minus the resale value. Specifically, when we were comparing the taxes and fees and all of these other inputs that I just described from a conventional vehicle to an EV vehicle, there are a couple of things that I do want to highlight. So we estimated for recurring taxes as well and fees for owning a vehicle. We did not assume that there was a difference between a conventional vehicle and an EV for taxes and fees. For insurance, we also did not assume that there was a difference between a conventional and an EV. For fuel, we assumed, again, that EVs were to mainly charge at home with about 12% public charging. For maintenance and repairs, the average cost per mile for a standard vehicle was expected to be lower for an electric vehicle in years 1 through 5, just due to the fact that there are less moving parts. There's no oil to change necessarily for an EV in the first 1 to 5 years. But for both the EV and the conventional vehicle, after year 5 and beyond, the vehicle prices for maintenance and repairs does jump up about 30%. And I think that's everything for this slide. So let's go ahead and go into the next one. Okay. Yep, that's actually got ahead of myself there. So yeah, fuel costs were around 40 to 65% lower when compared to conventional vehicles, and maintenance costs were about 40% lower. So without any further ado, let's actually get into talking about some of these specific use cases. So for starters, the compact sedan, we compared a Chevrolet Bolt EUV with a Toyota Corolla, and these are the most, again, common purchased gasoline vehicles and comparative electric vehicles. They're similar in terms of cost that you can purchase them at. Again, the EUV was around 25% cheaper than the very popular Toyota Corolla over 7 years on a total cost of ownership basis. The Bolt really does shine in 2 specific areas that really help make the case for it being cheaper, which was fueling and maintenance. And that was around 40% on average compared to the Toyota Corolla. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. Thank you. So again, this is my favorite caveat to talk about. So we compared the Tesla Model 3 with the Toyota Camry, and it looks like it was a special trim. It was the Nightshade trim, and that was the second most popular version, or excuse me, the most popular version, but the second most popular car in America. And we compared those two due to the fact that they were similar in size and range and comparison. Now, the upfront cost looks to be around $10,000 higher. However, that 1% cost savings with the Tesla Model 3 compared to the Camry really comes down to the fact that the Tesla Model 3 that we used for the model, which was the rear-wheel drive iron battery Tesla Model 3, which technically does not count for the federal tax credit. due to the fact that the battery at the time of the analysis was mainly built and manufactured in China. Therefore, it did not count for the federal tax credit. Let's just say for the sake of the argument, it was a Model 3 that did count for the federal tax credit. That would actually drop down the cost savings of owning the Model 3 versus the Camry to around 17%. So it really does highlight that fueling and maintenance does really get you a lot of cost savings for EVs. It's just the upfront cost that needs to kind of be offset with things like federal incentives, state incentives, utility incentives, but the business case for, or the personal use case for an EV is definitely there. The Model 3 had around 58% lower costs for fuel and around 39% lower costs for maintenance. So, all right, let's go to the next slide here. Okay. Looks like a couple of the slides for the compact SUV and the midsize SUV didn't make it in, but I think that's good in terms of time. So we're going to go to the pickup here. So we compared the Ford F-150 Lightning to the Ford F-150 XL. They're both Fords, they're both F-150s. For around 23 years in a row up until last year, I think the Ford F-150 was the best-selling car in America, not just the pickup, but car. So it kind of goes to show that if an EV can outperform the best-selling car in America, there's great cost savings there. They're around similar in terms of sticker price and in terms of TCO, slight cost savings with the EV, but owning the F-150 Lightning costs around 6% less than its conventional counterpart over that 7-year life cycle. The Lightning mainly has a much lower cost on the metrics, again, such as fuel, which is around 46% savings, and then 39% savings on maintenance. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. Thank you. So obviously this was a high level analysis and it does have some limitations that I do want to level set with everybody, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the analysis couldn't be improved or rerun in future years or made even more customizable, for instance, for Florida's needs or for any personal needs or fleet needs for anybody on the call. You can use the FPAT tool to get really granular data. And a way that we could recommend using it and to make it really much more fine-tuned and micro level is that we could use local fuel or electricity prices. Again, we use national averages over the course of a year. We could add incentives for state or electric utilities, like I mentioned. I do know that, IOUs constantly have incentives for things like charging infrastructure, which was not considered in this analysis. I do want to also caveat that. We could also make a more specific vehicle selection. So if there's a specific procurement contract that is limited to the amount of vehicles that you can look at, you can customize it based on those vehicles. You can also consider off-peak charging, which we did not, but the FPAT tool can, or you can also alter other behavior to really help fine-tune that TCO analysis. Okay, let's go to that last slide here. In terms of the next steps for a future analysis, what we could do is we could rerun the analysis for model year 2024. We ran this in March of 24 for the previous year, 2023 data. It would be probably a good idea to rerun this in Q1 or Q2 of next year to see if the trends continue to increase. There are definitely new and improved models. There's updated pricing for models. For instance, one of the things that we weren't able to factor in was the Ford F-150 Lightning, the 2024 model year. We used the 2023 model year because that was what was available at the time, but we could update it with the updated model, updated MSRP, updated range, and that could probably see even greater cost savings. And another thing is the federal tax credit is always evolving, always adding or removing select vehicles. Perhaps the Tesla Model 3 long-range version, the all-wheel drive version, which currently does count for the federal tax credit, would usurp the rear-wheel drive version. You never know. So it is important to just keep an eye on it and show that the cost savings are already there, but they will continue to improve over time. With that, that's actually the end of my presentation. So the next slide details my email and my contact information. If anybody wants to get a hold of me afterwards, any follow-up questions or things like that. But I'm going to go quickly check the Q&A chat and see if there's anything. Fleet procurement analysis tool similar to A-Fleet, yes. However, it is a little bit more customizable and just easy use for individuals. It does a one-for-one vehicle comparison. We also have another tool called the Dashboard for Rapid Vehicle Electrification, or DRIVE, and that is actually a whole fleet analysis. So you can enter up to 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 vehicles and basically perform what you just did for the FPAT tool, just with every vehicle. The FPAT's more like one-to-one, the drive tool is more for the fleet. That's also available on Atlas Public Policy's website online. And yes, both of those tools are free to the public, and you can go download them right now. So, okay. Will the impact be on the labor force as drivers and technicians turn buses electric? That's a great question, Ashwin. I would probably need to follow up.
Want to save that one to the question if anybody has any thoughts on it. So we'll postpone that one for a little bit. Okay. Our next speaker is Lloyd Graves. Lloyd manages Duke Energy's transportation electrification programs. He brings over 20 years of experience in the energy sector and provides invaluable insight to the Drive Electric Florida board. He's also a member of the policy committee. Lloyd, I'll turn it over to you. Lloyd does not have slides, so he's going to be talking off the cuff. You're on mute, Lloyd. There we go.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great. I unmuted here on this end, but apparently not. It is somehow on Zoom. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Lloyd Graves with Duke Energy, and I manage our program delivery in transportation electrification. And so, my topic, I don't have the data and the graphs per se to talk about the adoption, but instead just want to talk about the topic of will EVs crash the grid? And I think it's important just to talk in general about the utility industry. It's been around, for well over 100 years now. And if we think about the industry and how utilities work, planning is totally key. I think recently with the experience that hopefully people had as good as possible an experience with the hurricane coming through Florida, you can see that planning is key to anything in the utility industry, be it providing electricity, be it providing a stable and reliable grid, or planning for the future or responding to hurricanes. It's all about kind of planning. And so from a grid perspective, we certainly continue to plan and manage for EV impacts to the grid. There is lots of data that we have available to ourselves that we use to continue to sort of prepare and plan, and strengthening and upgrading the grid we do following the data. So, and I speak in general, not just for Duke Energy, but sort of for all utilities. It's all about using the data that we have through, meter reads, through all the tools that we have to sort of evaluate where do we need to have higher capacity in the grid or from a generation standpoint, and then what do we need to do to upgrade the grid itself. So we're constantly looking at it not only holistically, but we also look at grid clusters. So it might be a geographic area. It might be an area that's just represented by how the grid is structured to provide and serve a particular area, down to, certain feeders coming out of substations. So substations and feeders, that sort of thing. It's also important to note that as from a utility perspective, from a generation standpoint, we are required to maintain reserves. So we are very regulated, and there are requirements that we have to maintain reserves on the grid. And certainly EVs factor into that as we see the usage of energy across the grid and as we kind of plan for it. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about utility planning. Utility planning is something that is always ongoing. We do extensive planning not only on the generation side, but also on the grid side itself. So as we think about the bulk electric system, we have long-range planning models that are based upon data. They're based upon forecasts, such as what you've seen today in terms of EV growth and adoption. And all of that planning is taken into account. And when speaking for the utility that I work for, our planning horizon as it relates to both the bulk generation system and grid planning is 10 years out plus. And particularly as we look at EVs, we're constantly updating the data that we use to factor in the EV impacts on not only the bulk electric system, but also on the grid itself. By 2030, we sort of expect to see a good 5 to 10% growth in terms of energy consumption. And then 40% of that is from EVs. So when you think about that, just 40% of that is from EVs, it says the larger impacts are just coming from other growth. It could be from industry. I know in the Carolinas, we see a tremendous amount of growth in clean tech industries, Toyota battery manufacturing plant, EV manufacturing plants. We see a lot of load growth with data mining and data centers. So there's a lot of growth that we plan for. And typically from the data today, that about 40% of that is from EVs. So we're constantly preparing for, and we believe that we are prepared for this growth. Reliability always remains our goal. And so as we think about the core service that utilities provide, it's always about reliability. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we have adequate resources, both from a generation standpoint, but also that we adequately plan the grid to be able to manage it. And we do that with robust data capture and modeling. As we really kind of drill down and we think about electrification in general and EVs and other electrification, really the challenge is more at what we call the local or the hyper local level. So from a local level, I'll give an example of where the EV challenge from electrification might be fleets. So for example, as Amazon builds a new distribution center, or the United States Postal Service electrifies their delivery fleet, or FedEx, or could even be a plumbing or electrical contractor, and they electrify their fleet. Those challenges are what we call concentrated growth challenges. So that is where it's a local concentrated growth of energy demand. And that could be, for example, in an industrial park. Because in an industrial park, there may be not only the Amazon, but the UPS and the FedEx all located there. And so it's not just when one of those entities electrifies, it's when they potentially might all electrify. And that could create a tremendous load at a local level. The hyper-local challenge is really when we think about residential and particularly residential EVs. So I know that I live in an old neighborhood and overhead service, and we have one transformer that serves 3 houses. If myself and my neighbors all electrified, and I know I've got 2 teenage drivers and a wife, so I've got 4 to so cars at my house. If we were to, myself and my neighbors, to all electrify at the same time, that would certainly be a hyper local impact to the grid, and that would be a challenge for any utility to manage. So the real key there is to focus on kind of thinking about that last mile or that hyper local challenge when it comes to electrification. And we do that by not only focusing on what the data tells us, but through proactive ways that we try and work with builders and developers, that we try and work with individual utility customers to most importantly notify us when they're considering an EV. So we have programs where we work with dealers to provide information to customers so they can plan and communicate with us when they're adding an EV charger at their home. And I think, as Charles mentioned earlier, there'll be a tremendous quantity or tremendous growth in likely level 2 charging at the home level, because that's where great convenience comes when you can leave home every day and your EV is fully charged, right? So it'll continue to be very important that we work with customers to have them notify us when they're considering an EV. And so we can make those sort of proactive improvements. And one way we do that is through managed charging programs. And managed charging programs do a couple things. One, they let us know about hyper-local growth that's coming in the residential side, but it's also how we manage for EV growth in the future, and we prevent the grid from crashing, if you will. One of the things that's unique about an EV compared to other residential or typical local load growth is that EV charging loads are really flexible. And utilities can design rather programs that are strategic to help manage the EV impacts on the grid and balance energy distribution. So this helps during the time of day when demand is highest, but it also allows us on a great front to be able to better enable or the harnessing of renewables. So for example, if we have managed charging of EVs, we can either shift that load to the middle of the night when there's excess generation and grid capacity and the grid is not so stressed, or if it's a really sunny day and there's a lot of renewables available on the grid, we can also use and harness those renewables more appropriately to charge cars during the day, for example, if that's what the grid is seeing, and that's the best option there. So EV loads, because they're flexible, they're unlike an air conditioner, for example. I was having this conversation with others here about sort of the load growth in Florida. If we think about in the early adoption of air conditioning in Florida, it's not that unlike sort of EVs and local residential chargers. Those loads can be added, and it's kind of hard for a utility to know about that. The utilities had managed programs for such as time of use that help with the air conditioning adoption. But unlike an air conditioner where you want your house to be cool all the time, it's kind of harder to manage that load. EV loads are certainly more flexible and they're sort of easier to manage. So in Florida in particular, for my company, you're seeing that we have an off-peak charging credit program. So it's a monthly credit for shifting the charging to off-peak hours. And there are other programs that are either they're coming online that you should expect to see, more managed charging programs and options sort of for all types of customers across all utilities in the future. And so I think the key is for will EVs crash the grid is really two ways to look at it. And one of them is that the utilities are constantly planning and anticipating load growth, and our planning horizons are very long. And we constantly adjust our planning inputs as we see the market change and as the data comes in. But our planning is a long range planning horizon. And then in the short and the longer term, with the adoption of EVs, managed charging, I think, will be very important and will be a great tool and resource for the utilities to manage the impact that EVs will have on the grid. So with that sort of is the core of my comments. I don't know if there are any questions that have come in.
I have one question for you. You want to take a look at it. Adoption rates for most managed charging programs is under 15%. Does Duke use other data or tools to assess residential EV impacts on the local grid? And when 85% of EVs aren't participating, having data about non-participant EVs in the wild is really important.
It's absolutely important to have data about EVs, and there's multiple ways that we can get at the data and the utilities can get at the data. Certainly it's important if customers participate in managed charging programs because that's direct knowledge and information. There's also information in a lot of what you've seen today probably actually comes from DOTs and registration data. We can see as EVs rather are sold, where they're being sold into, where the DOT registration data. So there's lots of ways that you can get at the information without it being necessarily direct and without and kind of understanding sort of what's out there in the wild.
We'll move on now to our last speaker, who is Pete Westlake. Pete's the manager of new products and services for OUC, or Orlando Utilities Commission. He launches new strategic programs and incentives at OUC, which is a vertically integrated municipality that serves electricity and water to Orlando and parts of Orange and Osceola counties. Pete's the program manager for Smart Cities initiatives and beneficial electrification, including transportation. He serves on boards for several state and regional committees for electrification and transportation, including the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. He's on the board of Drive Electric Florida, and he's on the EV subcommittee of the Florida Electric Power Coordinating Group. Pete?
Thanks, Bruce. Looks like we're behind a little bit. I'll see if I can catch us up a little bit. So if you can go to the next slide. So when we start talking about our EVs cleaner than ICE vehicles or internal combustion engines, we need to factor in three main things: the fuel and the energy required to make the fuel, the energy and the mining requirements to make the vehicles, including the battery, and end of life. And so there's a lot of other factors that we could compare, but we really haven't considered them, such as the gasoline storage. Now, first of all, I just want to tell you why it's important. Okay, so COVID actually showed us a few things. When we parked our vehicles while we were worried about a pandemic, those vehicles were not emitting the GHG that we normally see. And you can see from the pictures surrounding, the air quality has improved significantly across a lot of different regions. And so this is why this whole idea of BEV versus ICE on air quality is extremely important. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we'll start with just taking a look at the lifetime production of greenhouse gases for ICE versus battery versus plug-in electric, which is also an alternative. On the far left, you're going to see three line charts, and those are showing the cumulative of GHG production for vehicles. And you'll see that the top line is an ICE vehicle, the middle is plug-in electric, and the bottom line is battery electric. If we start taking a look at what produced those, you'll see that middle graph. If we look at the light purple, that's fuel. Dark purple is electricity. Light blue battery production is battery production, and the dark blue is the vehicle actual production. So you're seeing that the manufacturing cost for battery electric, the battery is actually probably one of the largest components of that, and that's something you see in the rhetoric that happens about whether battery versus internal combustion is more efficient. But when you look at the lifetime, you're going to see that a battery electric vehicle produces 60% less emissions, and a plug-in electric actually produces 26% less emissions. So, and I'll look at some other things that are not factored in, which would suggest that this is even greater than. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we look at Florida. Florida fuel mix is a little bit better than the national average. We're not going to be quite as good as areas that have access to a huge amount of clean energy, but we're going to be much better than the national average. So we're seeing that electric vehicles running in Florida is going to be less than the national average for greenhouse gases that are produced by the fuel source. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, this gets even more interesting when you start talking about what happens in 2030. So each one of these areas show 4 countries. We show what happened in 2021 for an ICE vehicle and what happens for battery electric vehicles. And the next graph beside it shows what is predicted to occur in 2030 as we start realizing some greenhouse gas targets. And you can see that if you zero in on the United States here, we will see a 25% decrease in what we're achieving today. So as the grid greens, so do the battery electric vehicles. So you're actually double downing on what happens with greenhouse gas emissions. Go to the next slide. So there's some other things to consider. Vehicles last 8 to 20 years. The electric vehicles have fewer moving parts, thousands of fewer moving parts. So they're anticipated to last 30 to 50% longer. I think you're going to wear out your seats before you wear out the electric vehicle. Most utilities have plans to decarbonize by 2050. So like I said, you're double downing on cleaning there. And as the grid gets cleaner, so does electric transportation. And let's take a look at it. The electric production and transportation represents about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're actually tackling both of them at the same time. Utilities have we invest a ton of money on scrubbing technologies that take greenhouse gas emissions out of our production. So much better than what is installed in a car, like a catalytic converter. And the other thing is ours are centralized in an area away from populations. Tailpipe emissions happens right where you walk. And you can smell them in the car right in front of you. The guy that's burning that oil that just burns your eyes as it comes into the car. You're not going to see that with electric vehicles. Go to the next slide, please. Second life for batteries. So they will degenerate in time. Although I'll tell you right now that the newest studies are showing that batteries will last a good 20 years in your vehicle versus the 100,000 miles that once was thought to be the lifespan of electric vehicles. So you're not going to have to replace that battery fast. But if you did, and you can harvest that battery, I have a 2016 Leaf that's currently in operation. If I were to sell it, it's worth $4,000. If I was able to harvest that battery and attach it to my house, it's worth 3 Tesla Powerwalls. That's $40,000 worth of offset if I can make that technology work. If any of you have an idea of how to do it, please reach out to me. I need to do that because I can save some money on that. So, and next, we start talking about recycling. Almost 100% of the minerals that are existing in the batteries are recyclable. In other words, we can recycle those batteries and we can harvest those minerals and put them back into other batteries that are being manufactured without degradation. So we just need to make that more efficient so it's cost effective. And when you're recycling the battery electric vehicle, it's just like an ICE vehicle. You just have to take the battery out first before you do it. Last slide. So, are they more efficient? I suggest yes. They're 60 to 70% cleaner to operate. This will even get better as the grid becomes cleaner. Lifespan is 50%. We haven't even factored in the increase of a 50% lifespan on a vehicle. And when technology improves, the recycling will reclaim all that battery, reducing the amount of mining that's required for second batteries. So that's my presentation. Bruce, I think we can open it for questions.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Pete. We have 2 general questions, which we'll take first. The first is, what would be the impact on the labor force, drivers and technicians as buses turn electric? We haven't really talked much about school buses or transit buses today, but I'll take a first crack at that. There's really no impact on drivers. If you can drive an ICE vehicle, be it a transit bus or a school bus, it's fairly easy to be trained and learn how to use an electric. In fact, most people think electric vehicles are easier to operate than ICE vehicles. Technicians, there certainly will be an effect. It requires specialized training to learn how to maintain electric buses or light-duty vehicles for that matter. There is a lot of work going on by a lot of federal agencies, state agencies, and particularly the state university systems and technical colleges to develop programs to begin to train electric vehicle technicians. That's going on all around the country and will continue to go on. So I think that's being handled. There will be a negative impact, of course, on ICE vehicle technicians. I think those same technicians can be trained to work on electric vehicles as well. So net, there's probably not a big effect although electric vehicles do require less maintenance. Does anybody else in the panel want to add to that, discuss that? Okay, the second question doesn't have really anything to do with electric vehicles, but what private and government incentives are current and projected for microgrid development? I don't really have an answer to that. Does anybody on the panel want to try and answer that? Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think we have expertise in that area, so we won't be able to help you. I have one question I wanted to ask the panel to close things out, and that is, I think it's surprising to a lot of people that Florida has the highest growth in electric vehicles in the country. And I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on why that might be the case. Is there anything special about Florida that is providing that growth? And is there anything that Florida should be doing, especially to accommodate that growth? Does anybody want to provide their thoughts on that?
I can take a first shot at, and Charles, you probably have some thoughts on it as well. I think there's a couple things that go. Our climate is pretty amenable to battery electric. We don't have the extremes of -40, things along that lines to deal with. But the other thing is that we are a very large state for vehicles in general. So we've got a bigger population to convert. And I think as you start seeing your neighbor convert, you start to see that snowball going down the hill or in the densely populated areas. Charles, I bet you got a few thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also economics. The hottest markets definitely are more urban, higher earning right now, and there's many hot spots in Florida for which that is the case. And as Daniel kind of showed on some of his slides, as we start to see more entries in the feature-rich but also cheap EV space, I think we'll start to see accelerated adoption outside of that kind of traditional high earning, techie type population. And I think that will then lead to even bigger growth in Florida for the reason that Pete said. I mean, it's just a big state. It's amenable to EV driving. You don't have to deal with any of the kind of issues with heating and cooling definitely, but not it being cold. So I think all those factors combined with just general appreciation for the technology are driving growth there.
And I think you'll see some really big growth in rural areas as the pickups start to achieve mass production.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add to that? We're a few minutes over. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there is a survey that we'd really ask and encourage you to take. There's a QR code to it right there. And there's also a link in the chat. We'd certainly like to get your feedback on this webinar. This is one in a series that Drive Electric Florida is conducting, and we'll get word out soon on the next topic area as we move forward. I want to thank the panelists for all doing an excellent job. I learned a lot today, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.